Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters. How are you? I hope you're today on this long weekend. Maybe we shouldn't, it was, I don't know if it was such a good idea to the class on the long weekend on a Saturday night, but we'll see who turns up, inshallah. Today we'll be looking at Ibn al-Haytham, the first scientist. There's a book titled Ibn al-Haytham. It's only 100 pages. I recommend you to read that. It's a nice book about him, his contribution to science and knowledge. There's another book that The House of Wisdom, written by Jim Khalili. I read probably 5 or 6 books related to this House of Wisdom concept, and this is, I find, this was one of the best. Obviously, just like last week, we gave a background into the theology aspect of Ash'ari and Maturidi. Today, since they're both scientists or known for their science and philosophy to some respect with Ibn Sina, we need to give a bit of a background about that. What were the factors that generated the flourishing of science in the Muslim world between the 8th century and 12th centuries, in those 500 years. And I will just touch on that in this first section, and then probably we'll get into Ibn al-Haytham, and then in the second session we'll talk about Ibn Sina. Naturally, for science to flourish, you need many factors to come in and certain things to facilitate it. The main things are that, firstly, the Islam itself as a religion. If it was Muslims were religious people, Islam was very new. It spread across a wide geography. People were religious at that time. So if the religion was to stop knowledge, it would have went downhill. If it's flourished, then it must have been encouraged at some point in time. And we see this in both Quran and Sunnah. Quran being the main revelation in Islam. It talks about looking at the way heavens and earth are created and reflecting upon it. And for those people who think, for those people who have innermost pit of understanding, it's full of verses that makes you to look at the universe. So knowledge, that's one thing. And secondly, knowledge is portrayed in the Quran as a holistic entity. So it's not just religious knowledge, knowledge as a whole, ilm. Today, fan and ilm, usually people make this distinction. Fan meaning in sort of Arabic science, ilm is religious knowledge, but at that time, ilm was knowledge itself, which included everything. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, knowledge is the lost property of a believer. Wherever he finds it, he takes it. This is narrated in Tirmidhi collection. He also said, every disease has a cure. So once again, if there is a cure for every disease, then you investigate and find out. So sayings like this encouraged some Muslims who were inclined towards science and were curious about the world to study it. So this is a religion itself, Islam itself promotes knowledge, and within that knowledge there was no distinction between religious knowledge and scientific knowledge. Everything was acquired. And that's one of the reasons why we see these early Muslim scientists being polymaths. Polymath means they are expert in all disciplines, including religion. So they were both theologians, sometimes scientists, astronomers and fiqh scholars. As we know, as we shall see with Ibn Sina, he memorized the entire Quran by heart at the age of 10. Apart from that, The second important factor is the expansion of Islam to a wide geography, from Spain all the way to India, in a very vast world. The Muslims expanded, so they had access to peoples and their literature and heritage in a pace and an extent, the breadth, at no time in human history. The only equal time is where such cross-pollination of ideas was encouraged by sort of spreading was with Alexander the Great. When he conquered a large geography, including he went to India and so on. And that really germinated. Some of the Greek ideas went into East, some of the Eastern ideas came into West, and there was a cross-pollination, establishment of academies in Alexandria, Syria, in Iran, and so on. But obviously that sort of died down very quickly. It hasn't really become a part of the civilization with the Alexandrian Empire crumbling very quickly. So the second, the Muslim one was far more extensive, from Spain all the way to India and beyond. And at a time when, just imagine the world that people know as America doesn't exist in the knowledge of the civilized world. Africa, apart from the coastal regions, are primitive, a bit like Amazon rainforest that we know today. That's how Africa is conceived as. Australia is not known. Indonesia was just too far. And so the only places you had was the Mediterranean region, Middle East, and India and China. And some, ideas sort of flourished between those regions. But because Muslims now were controlling much of that geography, they can get all those ideas very quickly. So that was the second most important thing, factor, that the mere spread of Muslims across the world. The third one is, it sounds a little bit strange to go from a writing of the Quran to science, but Muslims had a need to have written copies of the Quran, and it had to be cheap. It was very expensive to produce copies of books in those times because it was written by hand, and then on top of that you had the material, which was very expensive, the animal skin. So to make the writing of the Quran and reading it, putting diacritical marks, really advanced literacy rate. Literacy rate increased with Quran itself. And with the invention of paper later, the paper made books very cheap. So therefore you could write books, not as cheap as today, but although second-hand books, for example, Ibn Sina says later that he had great trouble understanding Aristotle until one day he bought a commentary on Aristotle written by Farabi for 3 dirhams, which is very cheap. In a second-hand bookshop, he bought that and read the book, and that solved all his problems. Should someone answer their phones? Or switch it off? Yeah.
Sorry.
So, okay. All right, where were we? Aristotle and cheap books, yes. Okay. So the fact that that need to write Quran and read it from childhood all the way to adulthood produced the need to have cheaper books, and the invention of paper, and then paper made it, the writing of books were available at a very cheap rate. And with that, Muslims established these huge libraries. In city of Cordoba, for example, they talk about 100 libraries, each one of them having hundreds and thousands of books available. Obviously, people could not buy, not everyone, but you could go to a library and read and and then go home. So that was the third important factor. And the fourth one, which is also equally important, is the language. You know, naturally when Muslims spread across the world, mainly through the first Arab Muslims, Arabic became very important. It's the language of Islam, language of the Quran, and the whole, just about the education was done in Arabic. So, especially from 705 with Caliph Abdul Malik, Arabic was made the official language of the state as well. So that really, if everyone speaks Arabic and then books are written in Arabic, that means they can just flow around freely from place to place without losing its literary power. So that was a very important aspect. The culture, the knowledge culture built on that cheap books, and on top of that you've got Arabic language that's available to everybody. But five, which is finally the most important one, which really introduced Muslims the knowledge legacy of the world, was the translation movement. So the books being translated into Arabic. And this was, it's also interesting why that took place and why and how. And Jim Khalili gives three reasons in his book. The first one was when the Umayyad Empire collapsed. The Umayyad Empire was about expansion, really sort of conquest, expansion. The whole state mechanism and society was built on that. And when that sort of collapsed, it could no longer be sustained, when the Muslim world just became too big to be managed. Then Abbasid revolution occurs, and the Umayyads were based in Syria, and mainly, once again, even though Islam is a universal religion and there were many Muslims by now, but still it was based on the Arab tribal culture. With Abbasids, other cultures also became important, as well as Arab culture, especially Persian and so on. So there was a bit of a universalization of politics as well and society with Abbasids. That made them open to all this knowledge legacy that was available to them at that time. So it really starts with the Abbasids, the translation movement. And one of the foremost of those movements, the patronage from viziers or statesmen. There was especially a Barmakkid family. These Barmakkids were priestly family. They were Buddhist originally from Afghanistan region, and so you can be proud of brothers. They sort of become Muslim, genuinely Muslim, and then they rise in the Abbasid ranks. Actually, the whole Abbasid, this is yet to be tested, but my hypothesis is that the Abbasid revolution was an intellectual revolution rather than just being military. So it was a coalition of many elements within the Muslim world that were just fed up with the Umayyad regime. There's a really nice book written by the end of the Caliphal state or something like that. I'll get the name of the book. Written by Khalid Blankenship. He analyzes the last 10 years of the Umayyad Empire and gives reasons why they collapsed. It was that perpetual conquest idea that could not be sustained. So in any case, a lot of people were not happy with that, so there was a broad coalition which included families like the Barmakkids, and they actually sponsored translations because they come from a kind of a culture they belong to, and they sort of respected that. Obviously, they wanted Muslims to benefit from that. So this translation movement starts, and then it's also they sort of established these majlis. Majlis were discussion groups. Just like, we have entertainment, people have concerts. In those times, what entertainment is there other than just storytelling, where usually all average people went to? And apart from that, the elite, the learned and intellectuals gathered in these discussion gatherings, which were called majlis, and they would debate and talk about ideas. A bit like those TED, ideas worth spreading. It was like ideas worth sharing at the time of the Abbasid. And so they came and really put their ideas, what they learned. That really germinated learning once again, and translation. The latest book that was translated was debated. Ibn al-Nadim talks about 70 famous translators. Ibn al-Nadim was the Fihrist writer of the index of all Muslim works from 10th century. He talks about around 70 translators, famous translators, working between 750 to 950 in that 200 years. And they were paid like 10,000 dinars a month. That's like $24,000 a month in today's money. Imagine being paid that much. Like Caliph al-Ma'mun is known to have said, if anyone brings me the classic, scientific books, I'll pay them with the weight of gold of that book. So you take the book, they weigh it up with the gold, and you get the book. Because these books were rare; they were manuscripts, and sometimes you couldn't easily find them. And we know that he dispatched emissaries to Byzantines, and he asked for certain books if they have it, if they were to send it, with gifts and so on. So there was this campaign to get books in one place, which they call that place Darul Hikmah. Baitul Hikmah. Darul Hikmah comes later. Baitul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, which was established in Baghdad as an academy of higher learning, which included a library and scientists or philosophers employed by the state, and they were given various projects that they had to do it all together. Like Al-Kindi was one of the directors of this, one of the early directors of House of Wisdom. Like they were charged with some major projects that on their own they could not do. So this is a very good example of state sponsorship of science, and it shows that Abbasid really contribution to knowledge. So when it became fashionable, something good to do, to have these translations, obviously it really spread across the Muslim world. And on top of that, as I mentioned last week, the learned people, the geniuses, the most intelligent people studied this, and they excelled. And initially, Muslim scholars, they wanted to find out what did, some of these books were, like Ptolemy's Al-Majest, for example, was a major work about astronomy. But by today's standards, these books are all wrong, mostly, because it had the, what we call geocentric model of the universe. Earth was in the center and everything else. But still, they were pretty, it was based on observation, data collection, and it had theories. They were the cutting-edge scientific books of those times. So Ptolemy's Al-Majest, Galen's books on medicine. So these are all Roman or Greek scholars. What's another famous one? Euclid's trigonometry, the books on mathematics, which was basically trigonometric ways of calculating things. Algebra is later invented by Muslims. Al-Khwarizmi invents algebra. And this is the point I was going to make, in that Muslims don't first translate, but then begin to question. And I'm going to read from this book what I mean by questioning, from Ibn al-Haytham. And this is why this book is called The First Scientist, Ibn al-Haytham. He was truly a scientist. And the book that he wrote, the main book, is Kitab, the Book of Optics, is it's one of the major works of science. It's on par with Principia Mathematica of Newton. You know, that it's a major work. I'll talk about that later. But this is what Ibn al-Haytham says. The seeker after truth is not one who studies the writings of the ancients and, following his natural disposition, puts his trust in them, but rather the one who suspects his faith in them and questions what he gathers from them. The one who submits to argument and demonstration and not to sayings of human beings whose nature is fraught with all kinds of imperfections and deficiency. Thus, the duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, and applying his mind to the core and margins of its content, attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examinations of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. So he's basically saying that you have to question everything you read, scrutinize it. Don't just lay your faith and trust in them. Obviously you will read and you will put it through a critical thought and then actually then test whether it's true or not. By the way, this also, I should have mentioned earlier, this kind of critical analysis also comes from Islamic disciplines, which is hadith criticism. You know, hadith criticism is all about that. You get a report from someone who says, I have heard from the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said this, which was narrated by so-and-so and so-and-so. And the duty of a hadith scholar is to test whether this is true and prove it. And unless it was proven, it's always doubtful that it is true. So this kind of mindset, it culminated into many other academia. And in fact, you know, the act of referencing, which a lot of university students dread, you know, we talk about plagiarism, right? Plagiarism is an academic sin. And if a PhD scholar or someone academic plagiarizes, his career finishes. So you got to reference what you learn. So all of this also comes from the hadith science. Anything that is not referenced to a person in narration could be a lie, could be forgery. So, and then when you reference, it has to be to an authority in that field. So that all comes from Muslims. And so that's what Ibn al-Haytham said. That's why he's a scientist. He's got that critical mind about science. And it wasn't just him, it was everybody like that. And also we call him the first scientist because he's the one who produces a hypothesis, then test that hypothesis with an experiment. He's the first one to do that. You know, there were other scientists who sort of looked at the world, you know, observed it, and then theorized, explained how it works. But it was mainly based on observation rather than experimentation. So this Bayt al-Hikmah was an extremely important institution which became the blueprint for similar libraries around the world where works were translated and written. And because of Hajj as well, that's another religious factor. You know, at Hajj time, everybody comes to Mecca. So a book written in Samarkand or in Cordoba would reach Middle East in a matter of months, and which is very quick. So very fast flow of knowledge, information, and wide availability and a population who is curious about knowledge, which is encouraged by Islam and the culture of that time. And naturally, you're going to get geniuses who study and contribute greatly to science. And one of those geniuses is Ibn al-Haytham. Now, Ibn al-Haytham was born in Basra in 965. And he received some education, which means that his family was well off, was maybe well connected, because at that time, to get education, you had to pay for it. There was no free education. So usually some learned teachers or scholars would have private tutoring classes, or they would have so there were, public kind of study circles by a scholar in a mosque, and you could attend, maybe they would teach a few times a week. But other than that, if you wanted to get education, you had to pay for it. And there were no institutions that we know of. The earliest institutions are, Azhar University or things like that, or madrasa idea actually comes later with Nizam al-Mulk. Nizam al-Mulk, which I don't want to preempt that discussion with Imam Ghazali, the idea of madrasa, free education, becomes the norm in the Muslim world in his time. But that sort of comes later. So Ibn al-Haytham studied with people, scholars around him, and they're geniuses, they're amazingly intelligent. And because of maybe his family connections, at a very early young age, he got a job in the government and quickly rose through the ranks and became a vizier in Basra, like a minister. But soon he finds that being a vizier is not an easy job. There's a lot of politics involved. Administration keeps you busy all the time. It's not in his nature. Like, scientists, sometimes they don't like public. They like to lock themselves up and just contemplate, think about, write, and so on. So Ibn al-Haytham, how's he going to get out of that? If he says, sorry, I can't do this job, the ruler may be offended. If he escapes, his family is going to be dishonored. So he finds a clever idea. He pretended that he went mad. And first they said, well, he was a smart guy, like what happened? And they sort of suspiciously look at him, watch him for after a while, and just continues. We don't know what he did, but just pretended mad. And then he was relieved of his duties. And then he writes a book. He writes a book on how the Nile River could be, like you can build dams, so you can build barriers, dams, and you can regulate irrigation. When you build the water during raining seasons, and in summer when there was not much water or rain, you could just release that water. And this book that he wrote came to the attention of the Egyptian ruler at the time, al-Hakim. And al-Hakim thought, well, we've got a massive river, Nile, and why don't we... And he actually, Ibn al-Haytham gives Nile as an example in his book. So al-Hakim calls him over in 1010 to Egypt to build a dam. So he gives the money and all the workers, and Ibn al-Haytham goes and investigates a suitable location, actually finds a really good spot, which actually now, in present time, the Aswan Dam is built in the exactly same location. But the thing is, it's a massive gap there, you've got these granite hills. It's a perfect place, but the Nile itself is wide, 300 meters. How are you going to close that with carrying, earth with buckets? So it was very difficult with the technology of his time. Now Ibn al-Haytham, you know, he promised al-Hakim that he's going to build a dam, it's going to fix all the drought problems of Egypt, and now he realizes that he can't deliver on that promise. What do you think he did? Pretend that he was mad. He's gone mad again. Because this al-Hakim is known as a mad Hakim. He's the one who, I mean, he was mad, truly mad. He went on the throne at the age of 11, and then at 14 he sort of takes a bit of control, and he just rules with sporadically, and it disappears in a young age. Fortunately for Ibn al-Haytham, otherwise he'd be locked up for life. But he's the one who destroys the Church of Holy Sepulchre in 1006 in Jerusalem, which angers the Europe a lot. And some say that was a reason for the Crusades. But, you know, the first Crusade happens in 1096. It took 90 years to realize, you know, the next ruler actually rebuilds the Holy Sepulchre. So this guy was mad. So Ibn al-Haytham, you know, to escape almost certain death, he sort of feigns madness, and he tries to escape, but this time al-Hakim is smart also. He locks him up instead of letting him go. Okay, we're not gonna kill you, but we'll lock you up. So he stays in jail for 11 years. But this is actually a really fruitful time for Ibn al-Haytham, because in that 10 years he produces much of his work. And when he gets out with the death of al-Hakim, one day al-Hakim goes for a hunting and he never comes back. So he produces all his writings after that, most of his writings on science. Now, some of the contributions of Ibn al-Haytham, by the way, before I get into that, just as Muslims translated all those knowledge legacy of the world and made it available in Arabic language, and for the first time in human history, the entire knowledge of the world was made available in one single language and concentrated in one place, that Baytul Hikmah. In a similar way, a reverse translation also occurs, this time from Arabic into Latin. And the thing that really triggers this is the Crusades. Like, for instance, there's another book written by Jonathan Lyons. It's also called The House of Wisdom. And I also read that book. That's another nice book. But he has a different style in that book where he traces the journey of an English scientist called Adawiyyah of Bath. He is known as the first English scientist. I asked a lot of English, you know, do you know Adawiyyah of Bath? They say no. But Adawiyyah says that he studies in Europe, in England and France, in abbeys and cathedrals. Usually the libraries in Europe were available only in these religious places. And by the way, you know, a cathedral would, if it has 100 books, that was a big library, you know, in those times. So he goes, I studied all of this, but I'm more hungry for knowledge, because I heard that in the land of the Arabs, there is wealth of knowledge. He writes this in a letter to his nephew, because I decided to study Arabica. So in 1111, 15 years after the First Crusades, Adawiyyah travels into Antioch and learns Arabic and stays for 7 years in Muslim territory and also the Crusader-ruled areas. But he's gaining all this knowledge. He's learned Arabic, he studies all this science, and he takes with him a sack full of books and starts translating. So this reverse translation movement happens, and then the subtitle of this book is, the House of Wisdom, and then how Arabic science saved ancient knowledge and gave us Renaissance. So actually the European Renaissance was triggered by this reverse translation from books written in Arabic. And all of these books, Ibn al-Haytham's books, Ibn Sina's books, they were all translated into European languages. A lot of people attribute optics to Newton, but it really comes from Ibn al-Haytham, the foundations. So he wrote his book of optics, and in that book, for example, he talks about, he really revolutionizes knowledge of optics and light and so on. For instance, he talks about how we see. Like prior to Ibn al-Haytham, there were two theories about sight, how we see. One of them was from Ptolemy and Plato. They were of the idea that the eye actually produces light, it goes to an object and hits it and comes back. And the second theory was from Aristotle. He said it's not really the eye or the object, because there is a field, or the space between them is lit by light, and that projects the whole object into the eye, the complete image. Well, both of those are wrong. And Ibn al-Haytham actually says, because wait a minute, we look at the stars at night. I mean, are we saying that the light from our eye goes to the star and comes back? Because it doesn't make sense. It's too far. Because what about the sun? You can't, the sun just burns your eye, and even when you look at it for a while, after which a kind of an image of that sun appears in your retina or in front of you. So basically he reasons that you don't need to, if the light comes from the eye and hits an object, comes back, because you don't need that. The light may hit the object and come back at you. Because your eye doesn't generate light. If in the dark, how come you can't see? So he makes this reasoning and says that we only see because either objects generate light or they reflect light. And he says light moves in all directions. And this is a hypothesis. Once again, he's a scientist because he proves it. He proves it by talking about, because imagine a room, let's say there's a window there towards the ceiling, and that light enters from that room. The room is dark, hits that wall, and goes, there's another room underneath that wall, same wall, just opens into a chamber, and that light reflects and comes and it lights up the whole chamber. Because if light was only moving in one direction, that the room wouldn't light up. And he goes, even we could replicate that, so room after room, they would all be lit, because light moves in all directions. So he proves it. And then he also proves, this is what we call camera obscura, which is how basically this camera works at this point in time. He says that to prove that the light moves in straight lines, he says, just imagine a dark room, you have a hole in one of the walls, and he actually does this experiment. He puts 3 candles, and he says the image of these 3 candles appear on the wall. I mean, not only just straight lines, he wants to prove that the light doesn't mix. The light rays from each object doesn't mix or cancel each other. So he goes, when you close one of the candles, the image also disappears. So it shows that the light that's coming from there is hitting there without being mixed, because they're all going through the same hole. And then he says, he repeats this experiment by putting a hole through a dark room from outside, which produces that camera effect. Because you basically get the whole image outside into the wall of that room. So he invents camera obscura, which becomes the basis of photography later on. He also talks about perspective. Perspective, light when it moves in certain directions, you can give a 3-dimensional effect on a 2-dimensional surface through what we call perspective, which You assume that there's a one point and then light sort of goes in straight lines from that point. His writings were read by a lot of the Renaissance artists who applied those principles to their paintings. Interestingly, Muslims didn't and Europeans did. Another one of his contributions is what we call, I mean, this may seem trivial, but it was an important aspect. Why does the moon look large when it's near the horizon at night, in a full moon? Have you ever realized that? You know, in the sky it looks small, but when it's near the horizon it looks very big. And a lot of people explained it before him to say that because there must be something in the atmosphere that makes it larger, magnifies. But Ibn al-Haytham showed that it was an illusion. It's actually an illusion because you can see the buildings near the moon, so your eyes and your brain compares them to the objects around it, so it looks larger than it is. I mean, you can actually prove that by taking photographs, like hold a money that's as large as the moon and take a photograph. To you it looks similar in size, but in the photograph the moon will be much smaller. So Ibn al-Haytham proved that. There's another, just want to read a section from here. Okay, maybe because sort of time is a bit... I just want to maybe finish with some anecdotes about Ibn al-Haytham that shows his character. This man, kind of a nobleman, he's got some money, he wants to come and study with him. He said, "Can you teach me?" He says, "Yes, but it will cost you 100 dinars a month." He says, "All right." And then he studies with him for 3 years. And after that, when he says graduates from that knowledge, at the end he says, "Come here, here's your money back." For 3,000 dirhams or more, he gives him back. He goes, "I was testing you. I was testing you that you were serious in your learning. When I found that you were serious, I gave you all that I knew." So he goes, for knowledge you don't have to be paid. There's another ruler in Syria invites him to his court, and a lot of these famous scientists at that time were invited by rulers. They were sponsored, as we shall see with Ibn Sina. That sometimes gets you in trouble because when they fall or something. So he invites him to his court. He goes, "Well, I'm going to give you a very high salary." And Ibn al-Haytham says, "I don't want it. All I want is subsistence, you know, just for my basic needs, enough. A maid and a servant, that's all." Now, a maid and a servant may seem excessive for today's time, but in today, you've got maids and servants in your home. You know, washing machine, the dishwashing machine, vacuum cleaner. I mean, all these things are your servants. Imagine a world without them. Imagine, I know my aunt used to wash when I was a teenager back in Turkey. They were poor. I lived with them for 3 years, and they could not afford a washing machine. She would wash for 2 days clothes every weekend, and she was always groaning and moaning when she was washing. The poor lady, I always felt sorry for her. By hand, and that was that difficult. Now today you just throw it in, it washes, dries, everything. Obviously when he is by himself, he needs all these basic needs to be met, so that's why he asked for a servant and a maid. So other than that, he goes, "These are my basic needs, I don't need anything else. If I was to save your money, I would do injustice to all the people who could be use that money because you're a ruler." So it just shows the character of the man, and he died in 1040, leaving behind this legacy and a rich personality that, you know, faking madness was very clever. Sometimes you can you can escape from the madness of the world by faking madness. And sometimes also there's a fine line between genius and madness too, by the way. A lot of geniuses went mad towards the end of their lives because there's just mind is going on 5th gear, 10th gear, you know, working all the time. So, and these type of people, if you give them money and say, oh, just live comfortably, it's like punishing them. There was even a guy, I'll finish with this, there was a Russian guy who solved this very famous problem in mathematics recently, and there was a prize on that, millions of dollars. He rejected the money, he didn't take it. And when they went to visit him, he was living in an average apartment. It's very interesting. So I guess when you're after knowledge, you know, when you know the value of knowledge, you realize that you're meant to serve knowledge, not that knowledge serves you. So we'll stop there and for a break, and 10-15 minutes or so, and then I'll talk about Ibn Sina, who's another colorful character, inshallah.